Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us. On behalf of the Ontario Vehicle Innovation Network, the Ontario Ministry of Transportation, and Metrolinx, I'd like to welcome you all to today's Ontario Smart Mobility Readiness Forum. We're thrilled that so many of you could be here with us today. My name is Stephanie Rodriguez, and I'm the Manager of Strategic Initiatives at OVIN. Welcome, everyone. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge the land on which we gather. OCI's work takes place on the traditional Indigenous territories across the province. We acknowledge that there are 46 treaties and other agreements that cover the territory now called Ontario. We are thankful to be able to work and live in these territories. We are thankful to the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples who have cared for these territories since time immemorial and who continue to contribute to the strength of Ontario and to communities all across the province. I'd now like to invite you all to put into the chat where you're joining us from today, and of course, acknowledge the land on which you're situated. As you know, the purpose of convening this group is to make connections and learn from each other, share resources, and of course, see who are at these meetings so that you can make connections, check out which municipalities are doing what, and hopefully learn from each other. On that note, I'd also like to highlight our LinkedIn group, which is for members of this forum. Christine is going to put the link in the chat, and we invite you all to join that group so that we can continue this dialogue on that platform. Okay, so on to today's topic, connected mobility, data collection, and management. We are going to focus on the considerations and best practices related to connected mobility and data collection with the goal of helping municipalities leverage data to inform their decision-making and develop tactical approaches for accelerating and implementing smart mobility technologies. We have a great lineup of speakers for you today, starting with Alexandra Baldassare from the Ministry of Transportation and Matt Letavo from an organization called Left Turn, Right Turn. Then we're going to hear from Raphael Dumas from the City of Toronto. And finally, Andrew Glass Hastings from the Open Mobility Foundation. There will be time for Q&A after each speaker, so we ask you to put your questions in the chat and we will do our best to get to all of them. With that, I'd like to introduce our first two speakers. Alexandra Baldassare is Senior Policy Advisor with the Emerging Technologies Office at the Ontario Ministry of Transportation, where she helps lead and support policy program development for new and emerging technologies such as connected and automated vehicles, low carbon mobility, and advanced air technologies. Joining her will be Matt Letavo, a senior consultant and innovation lead at Left Turn, Right Turn, which is a boutique consulting firm dedicated to delivering solutions to help agencies and communities achieve visionary transformation. Matt has experience supporting transit agencies from across North America, including Ontario, to deliver transformative service improvements and deploy technology innovations that enable transit services to better meet the needs of their communities. Matt was also the lead on the Transit Technology Toolkit. Alexandra, Matt, welcome, and over to you.
Is on how this technology can be used to optimize local and regional transit systems, such as increasing ridership, expanding services and geographic coverage, and enhancing the overall rider experience. And finally, it's really meant to help support in facilitating the connections between municipalities, transit system operators, and Ontario technology companies. So really aims in helping to build those connections with key players in the space. Next slide. So the toolkit was developed as part of Ontario's Auto Plan, also known as Driving Prosperity. This is a Ministry of Economic Development initiative that outlines the government's plan to position Ontario as a leader in the development and adoption of new mobility tech. So you can kind of see how the toolkit fits into supporting that vision. The toolkit also complements the on-demand transit toolkit, which was developed by our friends over at the Canadian Urban Transit Association and Metrolinx. One difference with our toolkit, or this toolkit, is that it provides a kind of a larger breadth of information on tech from across the sector. And the toolkit's really meant to help address the gap between smaller municipalities and transit agencies, particularly those operating in remote and rural areas, and larger municipalities in Ontario in their capacity to adopt and really capture the benefits of transit tech. So it's meant to help support smaller transit systems with limited resources to conduct this type of analysis independently. Next slide. So this slide really kind of just goes over the steps that we took to publish the toolkit earlier this year. The first step being engagement. So MTO engaged with a variety of provincial and municipal representatives to better understand the challenges, the needs, and the wants to adopting transit tech. And this included doing a survey as well as case study interviews to gain insights and lessons learned from municipalities. Again, we also work closely with the Ministry of Economic Development, with the Ontario Centre of Innovation, and also Metrolinx in helping to kind of scope and plan the tool. And then we worked with Left Turn, Right Turn to develop the toolkit itself, and it was launched on ontario.ca in January of this year. So the toolkit was really built on the information that we gained through our engagement, and I think a lot of the value add is, and that was a lot of the value add that was included within the guidebook. Which brings me to the next slide. So here's an overview of what can be found in the toolkit and the different sections that may be of interest. One thing to note is that the toolkit's not meant to be read from front to back. It's meant to be more of a resource for you to jump to key aspects based on where you are in your transit technology journey. So on the right side of the slide, again, you'll see kind of like the key parts or key aspects of the toolkit, which include information and best practices around existing and new emerging tech in the transit sector, different approaches on how to leverage tech to optimize and improve existing and new services. It includes tools and templates, as well as a lot of great resources in the appendices that Matt will touch on to help improve your technology programs. And then also sharing lessons learned through the case studies with Ontario municipalities about some of the innovations that are happening here in the province. And then just quickly on the left side of the slide is the different sections of the toolkit. Section 2 really is like it's a collection of all the technologies we came across with Left Turn, Right Turn. It goes over, provides descriptions of those, general use, also appropriateness for different transit systems of different sizes, and other useful information there. And then section 3 through 6 walk through kind of the life cycle of transit tech, from planning to procurement to implementation to administration and maintenance. And then, of course, the final section there, which is the case studies to provide some of those lessons learned and best practices. And I'll now pass it over to Matt to go through what you can find in each of these sections in a little more detail.
Great. Thank you, Ali. And good morning, everybody. Firstly, I do want to apologize. I don't know if you can hear it in my voice, but I'm getting over a bit of a cold. So my voice was shot over the weekend and is only starting to come back. But I'll do my best here, and I might take a few extra breaks just for a sip of water, but hopefully you can just bear with me at that moment. So as Ali alluded to in the previous slide, we look at the transit technology lifecycle as sort of our framework for how we've structured this document to a large degree. And that was because we recognized that there was a significant gap between large municipalities and large transit agencies and smaller communities in their capacity to deliver on at least one, oftentimes several of these different parts of the life cycle. And a large part of that is due to just those economies of scale that you might get in a larger community where you have a large IT group to kind of help leverage for some of those aspects. In other cases as well, it's due to just financial resources and the ability to leverage and gain appropriate knowledge and tools to address these technology pieces. over the course of the life cycle. So at the beginning of our toolkit, we walk through the different components of the technology lifecycle at a high level in order to sort of introduce you folks to what might be the best sections to then pinpoint. The descriptions at the top end really provide an understanding and overview of what those the different components of the toolkit are really meant to help you achieve as well. So by going through this introductory part of the toolkit, you should be able to help, it should be able to help smaller communities identify where they may be lacking in certain skills or lacking in certain resources, or have had challenges in the past with prior technology programs. Then, going through the other parts of the toolkit, they can pick out the pieces of the life cycle that are most relevant to them and try and identify some ways around some of the existing challenges that they might be facing. So the second chapter, as Ali mentioned, is really all about transit technologies at a very comprehensive, but also very high level. So in chapter 2, we've developed almost an anthology of all the different transit technology categories and some of the specific technologies that exist today in the market based on our own experience as an organization, as well as the experiences of many of the agencies that we studied throughout the engagement process. So this chapter here really introduces the whole breadth of the different technologies, what they're most often used for, and also their maturity in the market, which I think is one of the things that is particularly important for smaller agencies to think about as they're trying to select and right size appropriate transit tech for their community. Each of the technology is also rated based on the appropriateness and scalability for different organizations. So on one hand, we look at the appropriateness for medium and large transit agencies and how the different technologies may be implemented within their scope. And then we look at smaller agencies and then rural and remote transit services as well to see if they're most often deployed. So the example here on the right with the ticket vending machine, you may see them as a small organization, you may see them at some of your peer communities, but you ultimately want to recognize that maybe this is not the most appropriate approach to dealing with fare collection. For example, for your community, there are other tools out there that might be more appropriate, things like mobile fare collection technologies that are less intensive in terms of a operating cost and a maintainability perspective. So in that context, each of the technologies is also walked through in terms of the key benefits and key challenges that might exist for each of them. And we get into some of the details of how to best approach and manage each of those pieces through the following chapters. So the first, going back to the life cycle, the first chapter regarding this in particular is chapter 3, which covers the planning section. This is really focused on detailing the different pieces from an organizational perspective that you need to walk through in order to best identify the appropriate technology for your organization and how to fit it in with your business. So through that, we focus a lot on discussion on needs assessment and on feasibility analysis of different alternatives. And we provide within the core of the document several examples, and as part of our appendices, many useful tools to support communities and agencies in going through that process. So one of them is a budgeting table, which identifies the breadth of operating and capital costs that you might experience when you're looking to deploy different technologies. We also provide different templates for options analysis and evaluation as well. And some of the examples are presented here on the screen. The second part of the life cycle is around technology procurement, and we talk about this in chapter 4 of the document. So in this piece, we're really focused on preparing and providing tools and providing examples to communities to help them prepare for procurement and to go through the procurement process in an effective way that ensures that they're meeting their business needs. So this takes those business needs and that feasibility study from the planning phase and puts it into a bit of action here as around procurement. So we talk a lot in the document about procurement strategy and different approaches to procuring transit technologies. But then we also provide significant and important examples of both RFPs that we've collected through our RFP library and that you can use as a reference for some good, strong language that will support your procurement, but also tools like an evaluation template that you can then go ahead, use and tweak to suit your needs most appropriately. But at least it gives a lot of you folks an opportunity to see what's out there in terms of different approaches from a procurement perspective and identify how best to implement some of those best practices and some of these tools into your own process. The third section on the life cycle around technology implementation is found in Chapter 5, and this is really around focusing on the project management after you've gone through all of that procurement work. So within any sort of technology deployment, every community, big and small, is going to have to manage that vendor relationship in some respect. So what we've provided as part of Chapter 5 are several different tools and approaches from a project management perspective and a system design and engineering perspective that you can then take forward and apply to your own internal process. So some of these things, some of these components really focus on that business process integration within your organization. They talk about the importance of testing and verifying that the vendor has delivered on the requirements effectively. And we provide a couple of tools that can support you in that, including a risk register and an action log template that you can work through with your vendor and within your organizations in order to make sure that the implementation is going smoothly. The fourth and final section on the life cycle itself is really focused in on that administrative and maintenance component of the technology itself. So once you've successfully procured that tool, there's still a lot of work and a lot of effort that goes into both managing it, maintaining it, and really understanding when it's best to start thinking about the next generation of that technology for your organization. So in order to really support you folks in that, we actually took this from both an organizational lens and from a technology lens as well. And we provide some suggestions around the skill sets that might be required for someone within your community or within your organization who should take on the responsibility of managing transit technology. So with that, we provided an example of an IT administrator job description. That might be someone who's a full-time dedicated person in your organization, or it might be somebody who's also supporting many other things within your communities. But that's a good resource to have if you're trying to find the right person to help support your technology portfolio and maintain it over the course of the life cycle. Then we also talk about some of the particular technology lifespans for the different technologies that were discussed in Chapter 2 of the toolkit. The final core chapter is really highlights all of the case studies that we went through. So the toolkit really takes those technology-focused case studies that we pulled together from several interviews and tries to identify, exactly what the lessons learned were through the process, the different vendors and the experiences of integrating their work into the local context. And different timeline and implementation considerations. And a good example of one of them that we included is with Milton Transit and their deployment of specialized and conventional on-demand transit technology a few years back. So in this case, the case study walks through the justification of this particular approach to deploying this technology, talks a little bit about the impacts to the organization and to the service, as well as the benefits and challenges experienced. So one of the key things from this particular case study that we recognized is that from an implementation perspective, make sure that your staff are fully aware of the program itself and also have the designated and delegated authority to make decisions. When you are running into technology projects like this, you will oftentimes come across a bit of a crunch around decision making and where a lot of things have to happen relatively quickly. So it's important to make sure that what was identified through this case study was that it's important to make sure that your staff have the appropriate authority to make those decisions when it does get down to game time. So finally, take a look at some of those appendices. There were several that were not talked about during this presentation, but the appendices are really a core part of the document. They really are what, from my perspective, are probably going to be the most utilized pieces of the document once you've gone through it once or twice the first time. So we've got a glossary in there. We have several evaluation templates. We have our sample and example descriptions for a variety of different pieces. So we definitely encourage you to take a look at that. And finally, I'll just close off with a link to the toolkit, also a QR code, if that's a little bit easier for you to pull up on your phone. Take a look. And ultimately, yeah, thank you very much for giving us the time to chat about the toolkit. And Ali and I are here to answer any of your questions.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Ali and Matt. That was great. I almost feel like maybe we can hear from the audience on, do we need to do a little bit of a deeper dive on the toolkit? It feels like we just scratched the surface, and obviously there's a ton of really practical information that that I'm sure everyone on this call really can implement into the projects they're working on. Okay, Mona, let us hear if there are any questions in the chat.
Okay, so no questions in the chat, and just a friendly reminder to everyone, as the presenters are presenting, don't be shy to put your questions through to the chat so you can get those answered. But I will throw out a question. So the question is, what would be your advice for a municipality or agency that's new to the transit technology space and just trying to understand the role of technology in transit? Like, what are some things they should keep in mind?
Yeah, I can start if you like. Sure. So I think one of the key things to really keep in mind is that to deliver something on time, on budget from a brand new technology perspective is going to take a lot of effort and support internally. And that might be from that one individual who's responsible for that technology program, but they will definitely need to get a lot of support from the rest of their colleagues in order to make that happen effectively. Technology programs are always quite complex. There's always a lot of nuance to how you might want to deliver your transit service and your interpretation of what the technology is able to accomplish. So I would say the other thing to do is to really focus in on leverage the tools from this document, for example, that I would say that first chapter that covers off the different technologies to understand what the general benefits and challenges might be. But if you have peers nearby who have gone through the process of implementing or considered even implementing these technologies, leverage their experiences. You will find significant opportunity, both from just a learnings opportunity from reaching out to peers, but also in terms of actual tangible benefits that you can take away and potentially leverage, whether that's partnerships on a single technology procurement within your organization and several of your peers to maximize some of those economies of scale, or if it's just in terms of a project management perspective, using some of their tools, using some of their approaches as well. We could only document, we in our toolkit, despite it being 200 pages long, could only scratch the surface at really what is totally capable and possible within the space of transit tech. So I would say that the greatest advice that I would give is really just reach out to your peers once you've kind of taken this 30,000 foot level view of it, and then reach out to your peers to get their opinions and thoughts as well.
Perfect. Ali, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, that was great, Matt. I think just from my perspective, advice that I would give is really trying to understand the connection also to policy
and planning and trying to understand where it makes sense to deploy this technology. So one thing in the Emerging Technologies Office, we always try to look at technology from a critical lens, from like a problem-oriented perspective, and trying to understand how these tools can solve specific issues as opposed to just technology for technology's sake. So I think that's also just an important aspect to keep in mind when you're starting your journey.
Perfect. Okay, thank you so much to you both. And I do see in the chat we have Darcy and Joel. We are going to hang on to those questions for right now because I do want to get to our next two speakers. And like I mentioned, we will answer any questions that we don't get to in our LinkedIn group. Also, just a reminder, this recording, as well as these fantastic presentations, are going to be available at ovinhub.ca. So again, continue putting your questions in the chat, and don't forget to join the LinkedIn group as well. In about a week or so, we will post the recording as well as these presentations on ovinhub.ca. And then the last thing I'll just mention is we will also send out a survey. So definitely want to get your feedback. What do you want to hear more about? What do you need to hear more about? How else can we support you on your journeys? Okay, thanks again, Matt and Ali. Really appreciate the info and, of course, the practical takeaways. Next up, we are going to hear from Raphael Dumas, who is the team lead for data operations and emerging mobility at the City of Toronto's Transportation Services Division. His team is responsible for data pipelines and digital infrastructure supporting the analysis of data and analytics unit, as well as conducting analysis for emerging mobility, such as free-floating car share, the vehicle for hire industry, and emerging technologies in curbside and parking management. Raphael, welcome, and over to you.
Thank you. All right, you can see my screen okay? Okay.
Yeah, looks good.
So my presentation is going to be a bit of a mashup of two longer presentations that we have in our unit, one being kind of a history of the unit and our place in it, and the second part, which I thought was particularly relevant given the speaker that's going to come after, is one of the analyses that my team has conducted around the transportation impacts of vehicle for hire. So our unit has existed since 2015. I've been a part of it since 2016, back when we were the Big Data Innovation Team, as part of Toronto Transportation Services, very large reorganization, kind of moving away from the legacy of amalgamation and having these four distinct like geographic sections based on former municipalities. We've moved to an entirely functional model. And so now the data and analytics unit, it sits within the policy and innovation section, which is broadly responsible for, I guess, policy development and project and program evaluation. What you may have seen about us, we do have a page on the City of Toronto's website. We help publish open data sets that we collect or transform automatically. Our data and our analysis have been involved in a lot of PDF reporting on different projects, be that pilot or not. In particular, around the pandemic, there's been a number of rapid response programs such as Cafe TO, Active TO, bike lanes, and quiet streets, and then Rapid TO, rapid bus lanes, as well as one of the things I'll be talking about today is our reports on the transportation impacts of vehicle for hire. I guess this one in the middle is we have a dashboard and a map of the state of Vision Zero in Toronto, and we help provide a lot of data for that. So our unit is divided into 4 distinct teams. Data collection, which is responsible for the collision data program and the traffic counting program. The data science team, which is responsible for analysis of network performance, aka congestion and mobility, as well as prioritization tools for road safety / Vision Zero. My team has a odd dual role: one, the analyses of emerging mobility, which was referenced in my intro, and then data operations, which is really like maintaining a lot of the digital infrastructure that our unit depends on, the databases, the servers, our analysis environment. If you're interested, or if I inspire you to set up your own analytics unit somewhere in Ontario, I'm happy to give a much longer presentation about the technologies we use and more of our history. And then a shared response, fourth team is Move, which they have developed, or they are a digital product team, but it's an evolution from a project that we had with Code for Canada to replace our legacy systems around collision and traffic volume data sets. And their product is open source. So if you are also finding challenges with your legacy systems for collision and traffic volume counts and data requests, please feel free to reach out to me, because maybe we can help you set something up. So this is our current organizational structure as of, literally right now. We just onboarded a number of people. So the 4 positions there, the 4 different distinct teams, and we have research analysts, project leads, data specialists, project managers, these team lead roles, and then the manager roles. I know it's possibly a little bit gauche to talk about salaries, but given that almost all of this is public information, and I thought, we live and work in Toronto, which is an incredibly expensive city to live in, but these are all the positions we've filled. So again, if you're considering this for your information, the salary band or if you're interested in applying to a new position, should that open up, salary band for research analyst is 78 to 85,000, project lead 85 to 108, data specialist 93 to 119, project manager 102 to 131. Our team lead band is 112 to 144, and the manager is 122 to 158. And we have 2 technical trainees from the University of Toronto's professional experience year program, which I would highly recommend you also try to pull from or recruit from if you have the organizational capacity to do so. I won't get really into our technology stack. We do have a pretty strong ideological bent towards using and promoting the use of open source technologies. This is also the point where I'll plug the fact that we are active on the City of Toronto's GitHub. We have what we currently have public is primarily around our data processing and other things related to that. Our analyses are not public at the moment, but we would like to get to a state where, once we have published something to council, then we can have companion pieces of the data sets feeding into that analysis are public, and then also the code for that is all public, but still a work in progress. We've grown pretty rapidly in the last few years, so still figuring out some processes. But similar to the toolkit, just mentioned, if you're investigating bringing on some of those, the passive, pervasive, or permanent data collection tools that we use, we can help kind of jumpstart that by having primarily Python code set up to pull that data in. And again, if you want to learn more about kind of how we're organized, both from a process, but also from a technology perspective, feel free to reach out and we will happily give you a longer presentation. So now pivot into the primary, or like the main analytic focus of my team, which is analyzing the transportation impacts of the vehicle for hire industry. So the timeline of vehicle for hire, and that is, vehicle for hire is an umbrella term which encompasses taxis, limousines, and what the city of Toronto refers to as private transportation companies. But I guess more broadly, well, if you want to use the TRB term, it's ride sourcing, because otherwise ride hailing, probably a more generic term. So Uber launched in 2014. In 2016, based on a court challenge, the city of Toronto passed a bylaw enabling private transportation companies to operate. Very strategically, we decreed that we need data to understand how this emerging form of mobility is affecting the transportation system, which kind of this is long before OMF was founded, and we really did not have kind of any or a lot of guidance to look to in terms of like what data sets we should be collecting, or like what standard format it should be in. In 2019, we published our first report on the impacts of the vehicle for hire industry, or the arrival of Uber and Lyft and FaceDrive, and made recommendations to kind of collect even more data to better understand things that we could not address with existing data. That came into effect in 2020, and then in 2021, which is what I'll be getting into in more detail, we got new data, or sorry, in 2021, we published our second report on the transportation impacts, which is what I'll be talking about in a bit, or right now. And we have another report due next year. So we are currently getting from private transportation companies and, well, from private transportation companies, we're getting trip data, collision data, and these availability records, which is like when a vehicle is available in the system, when did it start and stop being available, and where was it kind of moving around during that. We are, in theory, also supposed to be getting somewhat similar things from taxi brokerages and limousine service companies, with a distinction that independent taxi operators do not have to provide us this data. So if you're a brokerage of one, you don't have to provide it. And for brokerages, we're only getting data on dispatched trips, which are trips that the brokerage handles, and any kind of street hail data, which is 50% or more of the taxi market, is not being captured by our requirements. And also only one taxi brokerage is fully kind of complying with the existing data collection bylaw. This is the timeline of the private transportation company driver. I assure you the data is not this linear, but the driver logs on, receives a request, they accept a trip, they drive to the pickup location, they arrive, they wait for a passenger to come out, passenger gets picked up, and then they drive to the passenger's destination and drop off the passenger. Because drivers can be active on multiple platforms, we've required a unique vehicle identifier across these 3 data sets so that we can deduplicate the data for the purposes of better understanding kind of when a driver was actually with a passenger versus waiting for a trip. So trends from 2019 to 2021, trip growth slowed to about 5% year over year pre-pandemic. We see pretty similar thing in other markets such as Chicago and New York. And then during the pandemic, the trips fell to below 50% of pre-pandemic activity. The main kind of time of week markets that were affected are the Friday and Saturday night like entertainment trips. So from 7 p.m. till 2 or 3 a.m. But the weekday commuter trips and kind of everything fell pretty dramatically, except the more robust were the, I guess, midday and overnight trips, which were already kind of like a much smaller market. So we performed a lot of data processing of the trip data in order to answer questions around the impact on congestion of all these vehicles. Following our first report, the like big headline data point is that there are over 90,000 licensed PTC drivers compared to just over 4,000, or I guess under 5,000 licensed taxis. So how can private transportation companies not have an impact on the road network? And the answer, or the partial answer to that is, or part A of an answer to that would be that like taxi drivers tend to be like full-time or more than full-time. A taxi shift is 12 hours for a day, and these people are often driving like more than 5 days a week. Whereas private transportation company vehicles are used much less frequently, which translates to in kind of a peak period of a typical or an average February 2020 week, which February 2020 was like the peak of activity before the pandemic. Those 90,000 drivers turn out to be fewer than 12,000 kind of active drivers in a given hour. And then we did some data fusion with other data sets. So a real-time or historical traffic speed data set in order to route the vehicle or driver activity in our network based on the traffic at the time. And from that, we derived like street level volume of vehicles. And then we compared that to our street or like overall vehicle volumes. And at a neighborhood level, it means that, yeah, for in a peak hour, we have, you know, approximately 15% of traffic, or less than 15% of traffic in the downtown core are private transportation company vehicles. And then we can look at that and compare it to the aforementioned kind of traffic speed data set and see that you know, the travel times in that area have remained relatively consistent over time, while private transportation company vehicle activity may have increased. So despite appearances, there is in fact room in the network to absorb this vehicle activity without kind of causing dramatic or like noticeable in the data congestion impacts. And then finally, I guess, if you're interested in learning more, I've given 2 University of Toronto Institute of Transportation Engineering seminars on the vehicle for hire industry. I gave one in 2021, but it is not appearing on their YouTube channel. So I'm going to try to find out where that went. But my most recent talk was on our vehicle provider data, which comes from a company called Here, which maybe you as a municipality can get access to from the MTO. And maybe I shouldn't, announce that. I'm sure MTO will talk about that eventually at some point. But we found it to be a really, really useful data set. And I guess, as mentioned before, feel free to reach out to me about any of our other data sets. Thanks.
Perfect. Okay, thanks so much, Raphael. Very interesting data there. A lot of, I found quite surprising, especially in terms of traffic and what how that's looking compared to pre-pandemic and what it's like now. So also, if you find that link, maybe send it over to us and we'll make sure the seminar that you mentioned that's not appearing on your YouTube channel, send it over to me and I'll make sure that this group gets access to that. Okay, let's check in on our chat. Mona, any questions for Raphael?
None in the chat so far, so please continue to add those questions, but I will throw one out there. So a lot of great data there, Raphael, and a lot of the graphs you showed actually end with data in either 2020 or 2021, and I can appreciate that it is a bit challenging to get some of this data. So just curious if you have any more recent data, is there plans to publish some of this recent data? Where are things at with that?
Yeah, so we have been working for the past year on, so the data comes into our regulatory division, municipal licensing and standards. And we've been working on a pipeline to automate bringing that data into transportation services. And because we are the primary users of, for example, the collision and the availability records, we are taking on the responsibility of validating those data sets. So it's been a big, like, multi-stakeholder project, and it is not yet live, but is gonna be soon. But also, I guess, if you are an agency who has private transportation companies operating in your locality, and you say, hey, I want that data, I guess Andrew may talk about a standardized format for which to receive that, and then hopefully our code to do kind of that pulling in and validation shouldn't be too far different from that data standard. And so we would happily kind of share how to implement that, which could help out.
That's great. Thank you so much. I see another question in the chat, but we're going to continue on just so we stay on track with our agenda. So Andrew, will get to your question later on. Back to you, Stephanie.
Thank you. And actually, Andrew, nice segue. Andrew is our next speaker. So Andrew, you can always ask your question directly to Raphael. Let me first introduce you. So Andrew Glass Hastings comes to us from the Open Mobility Foundation, where he is the executive director, and he leads this unique public-private partnership where cities and companies collaborate in real time to produce open source data standards and software tools used by cities to digitize their infrastructure and manage all forms of mobility on their streets. Andrew has served 2 Seattle mayors, managed local and regional transportation funding campaigns, and advised cities around the globe. An extra special thank you to Andrew as he's joining us from the West Coast where it is quite early in the morning. So Andrew, thanks so much for joining us. A pleasure to have you, and over to you.
Wonderful. All right. Thanks, Stephanie. And let's see. I can't share it says, I don't think I have permission to share my screen.
Oh, let's fix that. Christine, can we either share on behalf of Andrew or give him permission?
Oh, there we go. Got it. All right.
Awesome. Thank you.
Absolutely. All right, there we go. All right, fantastic. All right, thank you again, and a pleasure to join you. I'm based here in Seattle, and I'm still working on my coffee, but it's a great conversation, and I always know when I'm in good company when the previous discussion involves transit tech and Lyft and Uber data. So it's a great sequence of discussions here. Raphael, thanks for setting me up to talk a little bit more about the digitization of mobility and specifically kind of mobility data in general. So Open Mobility Foundation, and wanted to start here just thought exercise. So I think we recognize that the way we move around our cities is changing quite dramatically. And many of you have probably, or just think about, those of you who have used Google Maps on your phone to navigate around your neighborhood, your city, a city you're visiting, that you've used an app to pay for parking. That you've used Uber or Lyft services, or even a shared bike or scooter. I mean, these are all examples of how transportation is changing in front of us, and the way we engage with that transportation is changing. There was Raphael mentioned the trips of people actually standing out on the curb and hailing a taxi. That seems in some ways so passé, and yet still happens quite a bit. But more and more that hailing is happening digitally. And so there's this digital transformation that we're right in the midst of. And I like to think of it as kind of a long arc, and we're somewhere kind of in the middle section of that arc as transportation changes from what it has been historically, which is very physically based. We've used physical infrastructure to manage transportation in the streets. And whether that's signage or traffic signals, or actually things like parking meters and parking kiosks, or in many cases actually people directing traffic on our streets, we've relied on that physical infrastructure for the most part to manage traffic. But now that traffic management is happening more and more digitally, and so this notion of digital infrastructure, we've invested in and built physical infrastructure, our roads, our streets, our bridges, for even our public transport systems, for decades. And now the tools to manage that physical infrastructure are becoming more and more digital. So I want to talk to you a little bit today about the Open Mobility Foundation and the open source data standards we steward on behalf of cities in North America and around the globe. So the Open Mobility Foundation is an international public-private partnership. We're a nonprofit organization that brings together mostly cities, but also regional governments and other local public agencies, together with technology companies and mobility operators, to co-create open source data standards and tools that those agencies, that those cities then use to manage shared mobility in the public right-of-way. And providing these tools that allows cities to keep pace with this kind of arc of the digital transformation of transportation. And so we create this opportunity to bring together these public and private sectors to help drive this data standardization and these tools that ultimately are helping cities create safer, greener, more equitable communities. So the Open Mobility Foundation is a nonprofit. We're an open source foundation. We're developing these common standards that are being used for really digital governance and this need to manage transportation as it becomes more and more digital. We're a membership organization, and we're made up of public agencies and private companies. Public agencies like those cities and regional governments join our organization at no cost. The Open Mobility Foundation was created by cities for cities back in mid-2019. So we are a city-founded organization, and my board of directors is made up of only city transportation executives. We are supported by private companies, several of which are shown on this slide, but many more behind the scenes supporting our work. And that's a lot of how we're able to do our work. So then bulk of what I want to talk about today are these kind of tools for digital infrastructure. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how this kind of arc of transportation digitization is being manifested within kind of city governments and on the street. And the first tool I want to talk about is the Mobility Data Specification, or MDS. And this is think of it as a common language. It's a two-way form of communicating between local governments and mobility providers and transportation mobility providers. And MDS was originally created by the city of Los Angeles back kind of 2017, 2018 with autonomous vehicles in mind, because the city of Los Angeles was concerned that as autonomous vehicles were more and more, if they were to become widely adopted, how was a city like LA going to be able to communicate the rules of the road to vehicles that are being driven by computers? How are they supposed to communicate in a standard way what a stop sign looks like, or what a bus stop looks like? What do traffic signals mean? And so they developed MDS with this notion of standardizing this communication with these digital transportation operators. But before autonomous vehicles became widely adopted, we saw very quickly what happened when shared electric scooters were introduced on the streets of LA. And the city very quickly pivoted to apply MDS. So this concept of this two-way kind of standardized form of communication to all of the scooter operators. And there were 10, 12 different scooter operators on the streets of LA, and they didn't want to receive data in different formats or in 10 different spreadsheets. So they actually used data to standardize that data across the operators so that it could be used by the city in a much more kind of easily to digest way. But perhaps more important than the city being able to receive data to help them understand where the scooters are located, what the trip patterns are the scooters following the rules, scooter companies following the rules set out by the city. Perhaps more importantly was the city's ability to communicate back to the operators. And that's where that two-way piece comes in. So through MDS, cities are able to communicate digital policy back to operators in this same standardized way. And in the form of micromobility, that takes the shape of designated parking areas, or geofenced no-ride zones, or geofenced speed limits. Those are examples of how cities are using MDS as a digital policy tool to be able to communicate out in a standardized way across multiple operators. Well, I'll quickly finish up the history lesson here, but as scooters spread beyond LA, spread to cities around North America and around the world, the city of LA did not want to be in the position of stewarding this standard for everyone else. And so they got together with a handful of other leading cities and formed the Open Mobility Foundation to be the ongoing steward, developer of MDS and similar tools like it into the future. And so that's kind of the origin story there. And ever since the MDS was kind of originally formed and the Open Mobility Foundation created in mid-2019, we've been working in this public-private partnership setting to further MDS and other similar tools. All right, let's see. Can I advance here? There we go. All right. So the Mobility Data Specification is now used in more than 300 cities in 21 countries around the world. It very quickly became the de facto global standard for cities to manage shared mobility. And that happened because of the kind of urgency around micromobility and kind of the explosion on the streets of cities around the world, but also its relatively ease of use and its effectiveness in allowing cities insight into the operations of these micromobility services in a standardized way to allow them to make sure that both the companies were following the rules, but also that the cities could tie micromobility and the use of micromobility on their streets to other policy outcomes, whether that was driving increased access to transit, whether it was driving equity outcomes, shift away from private car use. There was also the need to make sure that that those policies and those goals were being met, and that micromobility was a way to do that. So there are many use cases around the use of MDS, but it's spread around the world quite rapidly. And originally, as I talked about, started with micromobility, but now is expanding to other shared mobility services as well. The use cases, and this is, I apologize, the link here isn't actually, you can't get it through the screen, but via our website, we have a really kind of robust set of use cases. So if you're curious about how other cities are using MDS and specifically using some of the data that is being collected via MDS, the use cases are really important. And so this is a good resource to understand how other cities, and we have about 15 or so different sort of examples from cities up there on our use case database. And this is in the process of being updated, given that MDS 2.0 is actually being released next week. So our board of directors has now approved this new version of MDS, and it will be launched officially next week on Wednesday. And this represents a really major evolution for the data specification, because it takes it beyond this use case of micromobility and now applies it to passenger services like taxis, like Uber and Lyft. A couple of those key services that Raphael was talking about, free floating car share, even sidewalk delivery robots. So other forms of shared mobility that we see on our city streets are now included in MDS. And for me, as much as I love these additional kind of modes and use cases being included in MDS, what's sort of most valuable here for me is the demonstration that MDS has any number of applications in the future, and that we've taken the next step to expand it beyond micromobility, but the use cases for cities it's almost unlimited. And MDS is a flexible tool that really allows cities to be in a position to respond as mobility continues to evolve. Because we know just because we have new forms of digital mobility on our streets, that arc is not stopping. That arc is going to continue. And we need to make sure that cities have the tools as transportation continues to evolve to be able to really fulfill the mandate of cities to plan, manage, and regulate mobility on city streets. Privacy is incredibly important when it comes to data sharing. And this is sort of an overly simplistic view of how data flows from the actual vehicles and the apps that the users are using to access those vehicles to the companies themselves. So think of this as from Uber or from the Uber user, the Uber app to the company, or from the Bird app, the scooter rider to the company, and then what ends up actually going to the city, and then whether or not the city then decides to make any of that data public. The Open Mobility Foundation is an open source organization, which is different than open data. And we leave the decision around how much information and data to make public. We leave that up to the individual cities to decide how much of this and kind of when and where. But ultimately, this is about providing privacy protected insights for the cities to be able to understand how these services are operating on the streets. Most cities don't receive this data directly. Most cities work with third-party software vendors to receive, aggregate, anonymize, analyze that data and make a dashboard available on the city's behalf. Again, a couple other kind of links here on our website. We've spent quite a bit of time working with both our city members and as well as commercial members to create a privacy guide for cities to really understand how privacy factors into data collection. And we emphasize greatly through that to avoid collecting data for the sake of collecting data, but really make sure that there's a use case associated with it. And this is how MDS is GDPR compliant. Since this is an international standard, we wanted to make sure that cities in Europe in particular were both following the letter of the law there, but also following the spirit of it as well. And so MDS in its flexibility is GDPR compliant. And a lot of that has to do with tying data collection to particular use cases to make sure that you know why you're collecting the data that you're collecting. So I want to shift gears a little bit from mobility management to curb management, because the curb is another element of the physical infrastructure that is being digitized quite rapidly. And what cities saw during the pandemic, this dramatic increase in demand on the curb. We weren't creating new curb. So quite honestly, I think the curb is some of the most valuable real estate in our cities, but also perhaps some of the most undermanaged real estate in cities today. And whether that's from the explosion of retail deliveries, grocery, food deliveries, now we've seen passenger deliveries, but also other demands on the curb from areas, an extension of public space for seating or protected bike lanes or bus lanes. There's a huge amount of demand on this, on the curb and kind of the curb lane as we know it, to do more. And so how do we help cities manage that space better so they can do more with the space that we have? And so last year, after about a year of exploration and engagement from a lot of different stakeholders on the public and private sectors, we released the curb data specification. And the curb data specification is essentially a set of APIs that allows a city to digitize its curb rules and regulations, create a digital and very important machine readable version of your curb. And that's from how that curb is allocated. That's the actual curb rules and regulations, whether it's a commercial loading zone that has a time limit, or there's actually, there are costs associated with using that curb. All of that, that type of information becomes digitized, and again, in a standard format, so that the city of Toronto can do it the same way as the city of Ottawa, as the city of Seattle, et cetera, et cetera. And so then the follow-up is, once that curb is digitized and once that information is made available in a machine readable format, then cities can work with technology companies to then understand how their curb is being used. And that's in a lot of the events, the events API that is shown on this slide. Understand who's parking, where, when, and for how long, and then have the metrics, have the data to be able to make better informed decisions around the allocation of the curb or some of those other curb rules and regulations, or whether to charge for the space or not. So this is at its kind of core, the curb data specification allows cities to digitally express these regulations and measure the activity and then develop the dynamic policies. It's ahead of, says here 160 plus, but a lot of input went into developing CDS. But it's still relatively early. We're still in the first version of CDS. So while we've had some kind of early adopters here, both in the public and private side, there's still a lot of room to continue to evolve the specification. You can see a few examples of how CDS benefits cities, but really fundamentally, it gives cities and local governments the tools to drive data-informed change. It's really hard to make informed decisions if you don't have the data about, in this case, how the curb is being used in the first place. Then CDS also benefits companies. Just like MDS was actually a huge benefit of the micromobility operators at the outset, and while companies like Bird and Spin were really engaged with the OMF to create this data standard that cities were ultimately going to use to regulate them. But they knew having a standard form of data across all the cities around the world that they were working in was going to save them a huge amount of time and ultimately a huge amount of expense as well. And so companies recognize the value of standardization. And so that it doesn't mean that every city's rules have to be the same. It just means how those rules are expressed is in a consistent format. So the companies know how to plug in, and then through that computer and machine communication, those rules and regulations can be expressed. I just wanted to talk about a couple of the early use cases of CDS that we've seen. And here's an example from Pittsburgh here in Pennsylvania in the US. But Pittsburgh is using CDS to digitally share rules and regulations for this smart loading zone pilot program, where they've designated certain loading zones in their city as only available to those that are part of this program, a part of this kind of permit program. And then if you're a part of the program, you agree to share, the information about your vehicles, your license plate numbers, that sort of thing, so that when you're in these spots, the system that the city is using, in this case, it's a camera-based system, can authorize that you are in fact an allowed user of that space. And not only authorize that you're a allowed user, but then also automatically charge for the use of that space. And then the city can roll in other programmatic goals, such as zero emission vehicles, so that they can differentiate the pricing based on whether or not the vehicle is electric, for example. And so in this case, Pittsburgh gives a significantly discounted rate to use these zones if they are a zero emission vehicle. So it's tying the management of the curb and the understanding of how that curb is being used, tying that to some of the other goals and objectives. One other program that I wanted to mention that is a way that CDS is really starting to gain momentum, especially just starting here in the US, is the US Department of Transportation created a grant program out of the joint infrastructure bill that was passed by the US Congress a little more than a year ago. But the Smart Collaborative is a group of cities that the OMF brought together last fall. And all 8 of these cities that you see listed here applied for a separate grant, but they applied together. They applied as a collaborative. And so, actually quite surprising to me was the US DOT awarded grants to all 8 of the cities, because they really wanted to see this group of major US cities be able to experiment and learn together. It's a relatively small grant in the scale of being able to, this first stage is around prototyping, but this is going to allow really important proof points for cities to use CDS. So all of these cities proposed curb management projects using CDS, and they all were starting by coding their curb, by creating these digital versions of their curb and their curb rules and regulations. This collaborative is not meant to be exclusive by any stretch of the imagination. These cities are going to learn and share together, but then the whole purpose is to be able to take the information and the experience of these 8 and allow other cities to learn from that, and from the specific use cases, or from other opportunities to share the experience and uses here, to make sure that this is kind of enabling that momentum that I mentioned, and really the kind of expansion of understanding of how coding the curb can benefit not just cities and their curb, but also benefit the general public from improved safety, from the reduction in double parking, improved actual climate emissions, or reduction in climate emissions, from reduced circling, really some kind of key outcomes like that. All right, so very quickly as I begin to wrap up here, so what's next? And I mentioned early on that the beautiful thing about MDS and CDS is that they were created in a flexible way that really sets them up to adapt to future changes and needs as cities look to manage the right of way in this kind of more digital transformation. So we're already looking at how MDS can be a data standard for cities in the advanced air mobility space, especially as the air mobility comes and integrates with ground transportation. How can cities understand kind of at the ground level what that integration looks like and how that integration happens, and understand from a management perspective how those eventual vertiports are being used, and whether the operators of those vertiports are following the city's conditional use permit requirements that ultimately be put out there. That's a whole different topic for another webinar. but also some more fundamental, like real world things. So right now, when an emerging incident, whether that's a crash, whether that's an emergency response, whether it's an unplanned protest, has an impact on a lane, sidewalk, a whole street. We don't have a good standardized way as cities to communicate that out to the traveling public. This is a recognized problem by some of the major navtech companies such as Here and Google and Waze. So they would like MDS to become that standard communication form of communication that cities can dynamically share when lanes, streets, sidewalks are impacted, and that information can get pushed out to those navtech platforms and inform the traveling public. Just another example as we work towards maybe a future of autonomous vehicles. So quickly here, how to get involved, because the Open Mobility Foundation at our core is an open source organization. Everything we do is really in the public and is publicly available. These data standards, MDS, CDS, they're not proprietary, they're open source, and we will never charge for their use. They're publicly available, and it's easy to get engaged in helping to further develop MDS and CDS. We work in a working group model. So twice a month virtually, there is an MDS working group and a CDS working group. I'm gonna tell you a little bit more about that. You can sign up for the email lists via our website, and then just get the agendas and follow the work that's being done and be able to join these when particular topics are of interest. Raphael mentioned GitHub. So everything we do is also via GitHub. I'm not a particularly technical person by background, and so initially GitHub was a little bit scary, but I've quickly learned that it's not scary. It's actually a really amazing resource of some technical information there about some of the code behind MDS and CDS, but it's a repository for the information, for the how-tos, for the information about questions and comments about the future of MDS and CDS. It's a really important resource in our work. Both of those working groups, MDS and CDS, are managed by steering committees, and those steering committees are made up of members of the OMF, both public and private members. We also have a privacy, transparency, and security committee that works exactly on what it sounds like, works through a lot of the privacy and security issues associated with data sharing. We have a strategy committee that forms some of the future directions of MDS and CDS, and a technology council. And the technology council is a kind of a counterpoint to our board. I mentioned previously that the board is made up of only city transportation executives. Then the technology council is made of about 2/3 commercial members of the OMF and 1/3 public sector members. And they're kind of the final arbiter or vetter, if you will, of these data specs. And then they make a recommendation up to the board of directors for the approval of the different versions of these specs. It's the process that we just completed around MDS 2.0 and deciding on the future or the release of that spec. So I really encourage you, if you're curious about any of this, we especially for public agencies, the barrier of entry is really low, and the working groups are a great, easy, kind of low barrier way of getting a little bit more familiar with MDS and CDS, and also getting more familiar with the other agencies that are working in this. Almost to an agency, they're really open and excited to engage with their peers, because they all know that doing this alone is much more difficult than working through this and learning and experimenting as a group. So please don't hesitate to reach out if you're curious about the work we do, or how to use MDS and CDS in particular. And then the individual contributors are really the volunteers, are what makes my organization and also the work we do tick. And I don't have a team of software developers or engineers kind of behind me doing this. We really rely on the contributions of our engaged community to help develop the specs, to help create or identify the needs around where MDS and CDS will go into the future. So it becomes a really vibrant community in that way. So here's a few sort of sources of additional information. My email address there, the actual GitHub website, our website there up top. Please take a look, and a lot of information around use cases, what CDS is, what MDS is, how to get involved in our work. And as you have questions, don't hesitate to reach out, because as I just mentioned, the kind of the strength of these tools is really determined by the engagement, in particular from public agencies. Because again, the OMF was created by cities, really for public agencies. And so we need to continue to have that in engagement to make sure that the tools are helping us continue to be kind of on a successful kind of path on that arc of transportation digitization. All right, that's it for me. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Andrew. That is some really exciting work. Really love the curb data information. I had no idea all of that data is being collected, and I love the idea that you're talking about improvements on emissions, talking about safety improvements. I mean, there's obviously just a world of improvements that are available to be made, and of course with everyone sharing information and sharing experiences. There's so much that can be done with this work. I think it's also hopefully very helpful for all the folks on the phone who are, regardless of where you are on the arc that Andrew talked about, where your municipality is on that arc. We've got tools to be shared, we've got experiences to leverage. And then of course, we've got this incredible group of experts who have gone through it, who are going through it. As we mentioned, it's constantly evolving. And so I think the best thing we can do is come together in this way to, share experiences and really learn from each other. And of course, with the goal of transformation in mind. So thanks, Andrew. Okay, Mona, how are we doing on questions? What do you have for us?
We have a couple of questions that have come through the chat. So the first one is from Chris Gillis. Question is, are traffic signals covered under MDS or CDS?
The short answer is no. Longer answer is yes, with a caveat. So I mean, right now MDS is really focused on receiving data from shared mobility operators. So those are the micromobility operators, now taxis, car share, Uber, Lyft. The idea is to actually, to build the tool in a flexible enough way that if cities are using technology, for example, from traffic cameras or now different LiDAR technologies or things like that are detecting near misses or detecting throughputs in new ways, that information can also flow via MDS as well. So I think that's certainly the goal, and in fact, MDS for intersections, so not just traffic signals, but actually intersections, has been an identified future use case. So not so much at the moment, but that's certainly the direction it's headed.
Wonderful. Thanks, Andrew. The next question is from Chris M. He says, not sure if you've covered this, but do any of these dynamic curb examples have cities charging usage fees? So for instance, parking meters in 5, 10, 15-minute intervals.
Absolutely. And CDS was built intentionally with pricing in mind. And so pricing is a component there, and part of that kind of digital policy piece, so that the pricing, whether in any type of increments or time of day pricing or more dynamic pricing, that can be done because CDS allows easy and sort of real-time communication of curb rules and regulations. And Stephanie, to your point earlier, I think it's really important to recognize that, and certainly the Open Mobility Foundation looks to support our community and members differently, recognizing that agencies are at very different places on that arc, and not all the agencies and even the companies that engage and work with us are far along. A lot of them are just starting out, and that's perfectly okay. So don't feel like you have to be a digital infrastructure or data expert to engage here. Part of this is trying to kind of lift all boats, if you will, and even those that are just getting started, and those that are well along.
Perfect. I think that's a great way to round out the sessions. So once again, a huge thank you to Ali from MTO, Matt Latavo from Left Turn, Right Turn, Raphael Dumas from the City of Toronto, and Andrew Glass Hastings from Open Mobility Foundation. We thank all of you for your time, your expertise, as well as all your experience. This has been really incredible, and I have a feeling this won't be the last we hear of you. I will definitely be sharing, sharing questions around and making sure that everyone feels there's a way to get connected. Thanks again also to everyone who joined us today. As I mentioned, we will be sharing the presentations on ovinhub.ca as well. We'll continue this dialogue on LinkedIn, and we will share around a email survey so that you can tell us your feedback. What more do you want to hear from us? What would you like to hear in the future? And of course, any just general feedback that you have that you think might be helpful. I think that is all for now. And what else? Right, if we didn't get to any questions, again, we will put those in the LinkedIn group. And again, thanks everyone for joining, and have a great day.